So our next area in oceanography is going to be the seafloor. And I want to kind of apologize ahead of time. You may hear some background noise, and that is my bread machine going. She's a little loud, but I couldn't wait for like 4 hours to do this. So we're going to have a little background bread going here. So we're going to be talking about what's found in the ocean floor. And crazily, for the longest time, we actually thought that the ocean floor was flat. There was not a whole lot going on with it, which is unbelievable. So when we look at the ocean and the ocean floor, it's made up of two different types of crust. You got continental crust and oceanic crust. Continental crust is thick, oceanic crust is thin. You also have your continental margins. These are parts of the continents that are actually submerged in the ocean. They include areas called the continental shelf, the continental slope, and the continental rise. So we got a nice picture here, and you can see the edge of the continent there. You've got some beach, and then you can actually see as you start walking out from the beach into the ocean, you've got this area you're walking into that is that as you start going down, you can see you got the slope. You've got the area right at the bottom there that's called your continental rise. Then you have your shelf area, that is the water that is initially what kind of like what you're walking out onto as you leave the beach. And that whole area right there is makes up the whole continental margin. So your continental shelf is the shallowest part of the continental margin, extends seaward from the shore. This is where you find huge amounts of life. This is where most of your fishing is being done. The average depth of water above the continental shelf is about 130 meters, relatively shallow. I know 130 doesn't exactly seem very shallow, but it is. And like I said, this is where you find most of your commercial fishing right here. And one of the reasons you find most of your commercial fishing right here, once you get past the shelf area, it starts to get really deep and the water starts to get cold. You don't find as much life. When you're at 130 meters or less, light is still reaching into the waters. It's warm. It's much easier for life to exist there, including all those fish. So your slope is where the seafloor drops away quickly to the depths of several kilometers. A lot of times there are some deep canyons that were cut by these currents. When you have these huge currents, they'll drag a bunch of sediments down with them, and they kind of rest at the bottom, and that's your continental rise. Kind of like if you have a landslide on a mountain and where all those rocks rest, that's kind of the same sort of thing. Your ocean basins there are the deepest parts of the ocean floor, and they're right above the oceanic crust. They're about 60% of the Earth's surface, so it's a huge area. And surprisingly, we thought this area, like I said, is like completely flat, but it isn't. It actually has a lot of very interesting topography. So the flat area of the ocean, we call that the abyssal plains. And think about the flat area in our country. Those are the Great Plains. So same idea. The smooth parts of the ocean floor, they're about 5 to 6 kilometers below sea level, so really deep, high pressures, very cold. They have a lot of fine-grained muddy sediments there. In these areas, you also have your deep sea trenches, some of those interesting areas. Once again, exceedingly cold, major pressure. There's only been like a couple of folks that made it down there. In fact, for the first one that went down into the Marianas Trench, their window they were looking out of cracked. And if water would have gone through, the amount of pressure would have basically not just hit them, it would have literally sliced them in half. The pressure was that strong. Here's where you find some of the trenches. You got the Marianas Trench, the Java Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the South Sandwich Trench. What a name. You got your mid-ocean ridges down there also. Those we talked about that when we talked about seafloor spreading. That's that area where you have the world's longest mountain chain underneath the ocean. They have an average height of 1,500 meters. But they also could be thousands of kilometers wide, and the length of them is 65,000 kilometers, which is crazy. You have a lot of earthquakes along these areas, a lot of volcanic eruptions around these areas. They oftentimes have valleys up to 2 kilometers deep, what we call rifts, running through their centers, and this is oftentimes where you have the magma rising through these rifts. So hang tight, I accidentally missed that picture there for you. And you can see these dark areas right here. That right there is your world's longest mountain chain. You also have hydrothermal vents there, and these are really cool because you think everything's so cold, so dark, huge amounts of pressure, so you're not finding plant life down here. The pressure is ungodly down here, and it's so cold you think no life. How could life exist? But life finds a way. You have these vents, these hydrothermal vents that shoot out hot water. Sometimes it's just plain hot water. Sometimes it's got some sulfur mixed in with it, and you find life around these vents. So one type of vent is called a black smoker. It ejects superheated water containing metal oxides and sulfurs. You have a white smoker that ejects just warm water. Here's some pictures of them so you get an idea what they look like. And you can see why they're called smokers. They look like they're releasing smoke. You also, on top of the ocean floor, you have volcanoes. A lot of extinct volcanoes hanging out there. You got seamounts and gullyats. Here's some volcanic action underneath the water. All right, so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the last of your notes.